So here's what we're going to do. I've kind of compiled some of the important concepts from the review, from the study guide, and we're going to kind of go over those in kind of specific detail, or like specific parts of them, at least things that you really need to know for the exam. So if you remember from the study guide, the first 10 questions are more general questions. They're questions about some of the earlier concepts, but in a kind of broad way, right? Not really specific details, more kind of general ideas like the notion of hypodescent, some of the concepts of race, the Eurocentric tautology, those sorts of things. So here are some of the important facts that you need to know from that section of multiple choice questions. Right, so about 10 of the questions are from this category, and the other 15 are from the Alcoff, Linton, the Gordon piece on Frederick Douglass, and then the stuff on Du Bois. So here are the concepts. Let's just kind of go over these. In the 17th century, in the context of global European colonization and the related rise of the concept of the nation state, the word race became associated with cultures and civilizations, in particular geographical areas. So this is the idea that we talked about, the kind of proto-race concept. It's not really biological, but in the context of global colonization, the various indigenous places of the world become segregated by race, that those places, the Americas, Africa, Asia, so on, become racialized, not in the biological sense, but they're described as races, the American race, the African race. And they're cultural and geographical concepts that later then become, so we see, then biologized into the race concepts. Connected to that too, in some of the really early concepts of race that we talked about, as that concept develops, particularly in the second half of the 19th century in America by American anthropologists and scientists, this new concept of race develops that is kind of biological, not cultural or geographical. It's about groups, not particularly family groups, that then becomes a biological concept. And that's developed by American anthropologists and scientists, and with the particular purpose of justifying Black chattel slavery and white socioeconomic dominance over Negroes. This is all from the Zach piece. These are just sort of quotes from that. Then the next concept, still in the sort of early area of concepts of race and the genealogy of it, the notion of hypodescent, which hopefully everyone is pretty clear about what that is. But the notion of hypodescent means the offspring of any racial mixture will have the race of the parent of the lower status. One thing that's important about this, just kind of clarification, that the notion of hypodescent means there is no mixed race. Some people are a little confused about that in the context of some of the midterm questions about this concept, that literally there is no mixed race. And it's not that you're supposed to kind of associate with one part of you're mixed, and the society tells you that on the basis of, you being, a mix of Black and white, that you ought to consider yourself Black. In the concept of hypodescent, you are, one drop makes you. And it is a little bit confusing because this is not really how we think about it now, right? So you have to understand the hypodescent sort of concept. We sort of think of people as being mixed. Well, I'm this and I'm that. I'm not sort of a single kind of thing. regardless. I can sort of pick and choose maybe a little bit how I identify. That is rejecting the notion of hypodescent. Does that make sense? The notion of hypodescent means you literally are that race, no matter what. I'm also getting more messages from people that are getting kicked off or not able to get on. Okay. So that's hypodescent. Another important concept still in this area of the early genealogy discussion. In the Smedley piece, you remember we talked some about this event called Bacon's Rebellion in 1667. Theodore Allen argues, and this is referenced in the Smedley piece, that it's this moment of the Bacon Rebellion that really marks the invention of the white race. And that might be kind of hyperbolic, but it is a significant moment in really sort of separating out the sort of notions of black and white, that then set the stage for this, the notion of race, in the structure of a hierarchy, and particularly this black-white binary that shapes how we think about race as it comes to be in the late 19th century and so on. But this Bacon's Rebellion moment is significant because, in the context of early colonial America, there's a kind of ownership, a kind of corporate class in things like the Jamestown colony. These were corporations. The Hudson Bay Company, Massachusetts Bay Company, these were companies that were put together, kind of, some of the money went to the crown and some went to investors that sent people over in boats and so on to extract resources. The majority of the people that did the work were servant slaves of some kind of sort, right? And oftentimes they became free, after being indentured. But this wasn't really a kind of racial segregation in its initial moment, at least. But this uprising of both indentured servants and freed people, people who were indentured and people who had fulfilled their indenture and then were free workers, regardless of race, it was a mix of both white and black, servants and freedmen, revolted against the kind of oppressive, labor sort of situation. And it was kind of in response to this that, as we saw, the 1705 slave codes, some of the real trying to demarcate to kind of provide, welfare and protection for white servants, freedmen, and sort of a particular kind of slave status for black servants, and the impossibility of becoming freedmen. And so the separating out of the labor force, to make a distinction between, white labor and black labor, as to control the overall structure of labor, seems to be a pretty significant moment of this. And so really all this is just recognizing that, right? So the line here that Allen argues in the Smedley that the invention of white race happens after an unsuccessful colonial revolt of servants and port freedmen in 1667, known as Bacon's Rebellion. Just that kind of factoid is really all that you need to know about that broader kind of issue. So then there are several questions that come up around the discussion we had in the Dussel piece about the Eurocentric tautology, and the debate, the Valladolid debate of 1550 between Las Casas and Sepulveda. And in that, we see some articulations of the notions of Eurocentric tautology and the just war theory, this way that the Eurocentric tautology defines reality so that even normal resistance to domination or trying to protect your land, any of those things, are seen as aggressive attacks on European sort of colonial framework. And this becomes a kind of inherent concept of race that we see in the concepts of racism, right? That sort of talking even later on, if you look at Linton, even sort of talking about white privilege is an attack on whiteness rather than just articulating the kind of framework of the unjustification, the lack of justification of colonial dominance, right? But simply pointing that out, you're trying to steal our land or trying to make us slaves, is seen as an attack on European Christian domination, right, in this framework. So in this debate, some important concepts come out, right? You see some examples of the just war theory. You see some examples of the Eurocentric tautology. So Sepulveda claims, for example, he's the one that sort of defends colonization as a right. Sepulveda claims that the domination of indigenous people is justified because they're tertitatum, right? That's the word that he uses. That's an important word just to remember. We had quizzes about it. It was also on the midterm. Just this concept of defining indigenous people as tertitatum, which is a Latin phrase which means inherently backwards, in particular with respect to rules of reason, not being being backwards rationally, not having the capacity of reason to make good decisions even for yourself. And his proof that indigenous people had this state, were backwards in relationship to reason, had tertitatum, was that they resisted European Christian domination. Right? And this is a part of this Eurocentric tautology, because the idea is that because by definition, European Christian civilization is the best, indigenous people are irrational because they are rejecting the best, right? Is 1 + 1 = 2. They can't see that, right? Because it's defined just as obvious truth without question. And so the fact that they reject it means they're irrational, because if they were rational, they'd be like, oh, welcome this, give us this, the greatest thing that's ever been, right? The fact that they don't want it is proof that they're irrational. And this is a form of the Eurocentric tautology, right? Because it only works, he's only able to make that proof because there is a kind of, by definition, claim that European Christianity is the best thing in the world that's ever been. Not by any kind of justification, just it is by definition, and the fact that they can't see that is like not being able to see 1 + 1 = 2, right? So they are, by definition, not rational. The second part, this is kind of part of the same thing. We mentioned this in just the general framework, but Sepulveda, uses a kind of just war framework. If we remember the just war framework, are ways of justifying in international law going back to this time in particular, and even earlier on in some forms. But basically the idea is how do you justify going to war in particular? And then there's obviously discussions of justifying particular actions that you do, because war is killing people and invading land and things that ordinarily would be wrong, but there's certain kinds of justifications that then make war just, not just going and killing people or invading. And from Francisco de Vitoria in the early 1500s, we get some of the framework of what is modern just war theory or international law around this, that differences of religion, extension of empire, acquisition of wealth, those are all illegal. They don't justify going to war against someone. And part of that is that, what you want to justify is invading someone, right? Defending yourself is always justified, but going to war, you can't use religion, extension of your empire, acquisition of wealth to invade someone. It has to be something that they did wrong, something they did wrong to you. And here we see again Sepulveda using the operation of the Eurocentric tautology to flip this around by saying, even though we're the ones that are invading indigenous people, right? Their resistance is a form of aggressive attack because they're rejecting truth and sort of civilization, and that's an attack on us, you know. And so that makes our invasion of them actually justified, because their resistance, if you see here, that to the Eurocentric tautology to declare that indigenous resistance to European invasion is actually an illegal and aggressive attack on Europeans, right? So they're being attacked by indigenous resistance. That makes their invasion legal, right? It's a defensive war because they're being attacked, which is kind of, obviously it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of totally backwards. But what makes it make sense is the Eurocentric tautology, right? Because by, you know, resisting, they're resisting 1 + 1 = 2, right? And that's an attack on reason, on attack on the civilization, the true civilization of the world, by rejecting it. And so that makes European invasion of indigenous America justified under the just war. So basically just that concept that's there. Sepulveda is able to create a just war framework for an invasion of America under Francisco de Vitoria's just war rules, because he used an operation of the Eurocentric tautology to declare that indigenous resistance to European invasion is actually an illegal and aggressive attack on Europeans, which makes war against indigenous people a justified defensive war. And this is already a quiz. We had a quiz question. There was also a midterm question around this kind of concept, right? So any questions so far? We only have a few more, a couple from Locke and a couple from the racial contract, some of these that are from the earlier sections. Are there any particular questions about what we've gone over so far before I move on to the next?
I have a question about
Yes.
hypodescent. Okay, so, and I remember we talked about like how the blood quanta rules are kind of like fundamentally irrational, but is that something that's considered outside of hypodescent and hyperdescent?
Yeah, so I mean, what's going on there is that, okay, so there's the concept of hypodescent, right? And hypodescent is the concept of race that is particularly applied in the context of slavery and defining race in its original form, this new biological concept in America, you know, that's supposed to justify chattel slavery and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Hypodescent is used there. And that's the kind of, you know, the one drop rule, essentially. Another way of thinking about hypodescent, as people have talked about in some of the things they wrote in the midterm, is the one drop rule, because it literally means your race is determined, not just suggested. You literally are the race. Even in this context, if you have one drop of black blood, you are black. That is your race, no matter how you look and any of those things. That's the hypodescent concept as it sort of functioned in that time in America in relationship to African American people. Now, what makes it this sort of contradiction that you're talking about is that on the one hand, that's used in relationship to African Americans, the concept of hypodescent. But in relationship to Native people, Native Americans, the opposite, contradictory concept, not hyperdescent, that people are a race above, that they become white if they have one drop, just the kind of not hyperdescent,
Okay.
right? Hypodescent. For Native people, all it is if you have one drop of non-Native blood, you are not Native. You just lose. It's a kind of negation of hypodescent. You lose your nativeness by any mixing, right? And it's just what we see there is that the definitions are not rational. The definitions are just made up in particular context, not as sort of logical ideas of race, but the definitions are made up in particular context to protect certain kinds of exploitative strategies. One is the maintaining of slavery. No matter how many generations, you know, there's going to be one drop of black blood, right? So every Black person is going to be a slave if that's what determins it. And for Native people, if being Native means you must have pure Native blood, that any kind of admixture at all, you lose your nativeness, then that's an eradication. So one is a kind of logic of preservation, and one is a logic of elimination. And those are based on the need to eliminate the 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 biological status of indigenous people because they are the owners of the land, and to maintain the biological status of a slave class based on notions of hypodescent. And they don't even make any sense, and nobody really cares, because all that really matters is having some kind of concept that justifies the processes of what we're trying to do. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there's a particular question that really asks you to articulate that, and in particular, all the questions are multiple choice. So there's not questions even like the midterm that was, where you had to kind of try to put those in your own words. Everything here is just pretty straightforward, objective, kind of knowing the ideas in a pretty factual way. You don't even have to really be able to put them in your own words to be successful here.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Any other questions about where we're at? We've looked at some of the early kind of concepts, a little bit from the Sepulveda essay, and then we're going to look at a couple here around the racial contract, and also some other stuff about the Eurocentric tautology. Anything else? You can jump in at any point if you do have questions.